welcome to Atlanta Mix 108. Up next is Author Talk with your host, M.L.Ruscsak.
Welcome, Atlanta, to another edition of Author Talk with your host, M.L.Ruscsak. I'm here with Les Cochran. He has some fabulous books that he's going to share with us tonight. The first series we're going to talk about and mainly talk about is his Detroit Thornbirds Defy Mafia. Did I pronounce that right?
You got it right. It is. I have a lot of people that ask me, first question is, what is a thornbird? Well, is it all right? I'll just start out with that.
Just go ahead.
You may remember there's a myth about the thornbirds. It was reported in a book called The Thornbirds in 1977, and not much has been done with the concept. But essentially, a thornbird is a bird that searches its whole life for a thorn tree. And what it is, it's about dedication and commitment and love, willing to die for a cause. And I picked that up because the people I write about in my Mafia series, what I call them the Detroit Thornbirds, are people, regular people on the streets, and they're fighting an upward battle. Say, for example, I'm not going to pay the tax imposed by the mob. I'm not going to do this by the black gangs at the time. And so they're not just regular people that walk down the street and do nothing. These are people that are fighting to save their homes and to make a difference. And I came in contact with these people back in the early 70s, and so that's what I write about.
Now, your first book in the series is called Sex Club.
Yes, Sex Club. Sex Club came out a couple years ago. It starts in 1977 as each of my books takes a 2-year snippet out of the history of the Detroit Mafia. So it is historical fiction, or maybe better said, historical crime fiction, and it portrays my characters weaving their way through the crisis that's going on in the city. In Sex Club, the actual word or name was an actual strip club. And I hate to admit this on radio, but when I was a little younger, it was a place that I went to on occasion. Doing research, of course.
Of course.
So
that's what
in the first series,
are for, right?
Right. And so in this series, I have a series of characters that fit into the story. Detective Clark Phillips is the lead character, but he plays poker with some of his high school buddies and college friends and a Catholic priest. So the story goes various ways. It gets into the activities of the mob in connection with money laundering with the Catholic Church. It gets into the struggles of some of these people and their wives dealing with the restrictions and of the mob, and so that's where this goes. And so when you read the book, if you read about a restaurant, it's a real restaurant, and you order off the menu. When they go to a ball game, for example, it's the real game that happened in Tiger Stadium that night. And so, so it's kind of interesting. I think anyone who would even have a notion of Detroit would understand that.
So you have a lot of accurate information in the book, not just off the top of your head. You did a lot of research.
Right. I spend probably 2 or 3 days or hours a day researching, and I have volumes on the Detroit Mafia. It's amazing what you can find. When you keep digging. I found, for example, I was Googling, and I was on like page 30, and I found a word, and I kept following it, and it ended up being that I found that there is, in fact, what they call the commission, and these are the 24 heads of mafia that meet annually to talk about issues and concerns that they have, and they started in 1933. So it's kind of interesting.
Yes, that is. I would never have known that.
Well, I didn't either, and I was halfway through the book when I found out.
Okay, so we go from Sex Club into your recently released book, Blind Pig.
Yes, and Blind Pig, do you know what a blind pig is?
A police officer that turns a blind eye.
That's right. And it is then the places that these corrupt police officers, where the local people go for a little action. They open up at 2 o'clock and they run till about 6 o'clock in the morning. They started back in the 20s and 30s with the speakeasies, and of course those were very glitzy and where the rich people went. Well, the poor people in the inner cities couldn't go to places like that, so the local bar or a community center served that purpose. And so there was a little gambling in the back, a prostitution hanging around, and of course drugs were being sold pretty openly at that time. So that is what goes on. And so in the process, some of these were independent, but many of these blind pigs were run by the mafia. And so my story in Blind Pig then is about the efforts of some of the people in the community trying to shut down the blind pigs, and of course some of my characters, are eliminated, so to speak. But it is again historical crime fiction, and everything in the book, newspaper clippings is accurate, except the part of my characters that are weaving through trying to solve real murders and crises that are going on at the time. So I'm really excited about that book.
This series is very interesting. As much researchers that you're doing and how much weaving you have to do to create a fictional book from nonfiction elements.
Right. And one of the things that I pride myself in, I try to narrow the line between fact and fiction. And so the one time there'll be a newspaper clipping which is actual. It happens, something happened in Detroit at the time. The next one may be one that I've made up because it's about my characters. And so as you weave through this, you say, well, that was real. And people tend to start believing that it's all real. And so it's kind of interesting when you do an interview or somebody sits down and talks about the book and they want to know these characters. Well, who are they? And they said, well, that part is fictional. And I think it's kind of fun for people to try and say, now, is this real or not?
That's always fun as a reader, trying to figure out facts from fiction. It's always fun trying to figure out, okay, do I need to do my own research just to figure out if these characters existed or if this is part of the story made up by the mind of the creator? Yeah,
and one of the things I've done in this, in Blind Pig, and that first time I've tried it, I have a picture of the character, Clark Phillips, and I write about, where he lived, which is a place where I taught high school when I was in Detroit. And so now you have this picture of this individual, which is a little unusual because most authors don't put a picture, of the characters. And so it's a concept that I'm trying, and I've gotten really good feedback because people say, I know Clark Phillips, kind of so to speak.
Yeah. It's always interesting when an author goes the extra mile in their books. And to me, that's just a mind-blowing piece.
Yeah, well, thank you. The other thing that I've done is, in fact, putting the real clippings of the newspaper, and that's a way when I'm writing about this 2-year period, I can put in a clipping of a real newspaper article that fits into the story, of course, and it's kind of like a little outline, and I've gotten really good comments from people about, the clippings, even though some of them are fictional.
That is really interesting. That
yes,
just makes me, I'm not usually one that reads crime fiction, but the way you're describing everything on the pages and everything in between the pages, it makes me want to pick it up just to try to figure out what you wrote that is fictional and what's reality, or was reality back in the 70s.
Right. Well, the other thing that I do is I try to let the dialogue carry the story. One of my early editors said, you tell too much, you describe too much. And, of course, I was a professor at one time, and so, as you know, professors seem to talk and write about 10 pages and say nothing. And so she was very critical of me in my early years of writing fiction. And so I'd say that probably 80% of the books now are dialogue by the characters carrying the story, and I think that helps it flow very quickly, so it makes it an easy read.
I've read books both ways. One that has the author very detail-orientated, very little dialogue, that are wonderful, and I've read books that are full of dialogue with very little backstory that are just as captivating. From a reader's point of view, it all depends on how you portray your book.
Absolutely. And if there was one standard way or best way of doing it, all the books would be that way. And, of course, they're not. That's one of the beauties about reading a book is you pick up a different style or a different approach every time you deal with a different author. So it's kind of mind-boggling in that regard. The other thing that I tell you that go ahead. Well, the other thing that I'm excited about is I just sent to the editor Get Even, which is my book for this year. As I said, I was cranking out a book a year, and it takes the story 2 more years. And the term in this case, Get Even, was because in my research, in the particular 2 years that I was covering, everybody was in a mode of getting even. And I heard, I was just picking up the research, and they said, we're getting even, and because it was a time when heroin hit Detroit. Most people think that Detroit died in the riots. Well, that was the beginning of it, but it was almost like a perfect storm that hit Detroit. The auto industry tanked, drugs hit, people didn't have any jobs, and so sometimes the runners, as they called them, the 12-year-olds who were working for the gangs, were the only breadwinner in the family. And so there's a lot in the book about the cultural change that happened during this time, because it becomes acceptable in a family to have your son selling drugs because he's the only person that's working.
That makes a lot of sense versus what we see now, what it's evolved to.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how if you think about it, how the government did nothing about the drug problems at that time, and as you said, opened the door for the floodgate, or so to speak, of what's going on now. But it does help me understand, and I think it will help the readers understand that if your son is 12 years old, and here's what the deal was. He sold a bag of heroin for $13. The mob gets 10, and he gets 3. there were examples of kids, 12-year-olds, walking around with $2,000-$3,000 in their pocket. Can you imagine that? It's just mind-boggling. In one case, where a 15-year-old walked in with $62,000 in a grocery bag and laid it on the table and bought a new BMW. It's just
mind-boggling.
Our whole society, the society collapsed. The churches failed. The schools failed. Half of the kids are dropping out. The churches did nothing. It was just kind of, it's a crazy time in Detroit and other cities. Philadelphia went through the same thing. In fact, Philadelphia was far more violent than Detroit was. But I think people help them understand that what happened in our inner cities just didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't just bad people. It was, this was survival.
It makes you look at what's going on now in a different light. If this would have been stopped or dealt with decades ago, would we have some of these problems that we have today?
Absolutely.
We may never know that answer, but it's a good question to throw out there to make people think.
Yeah, well, I think that's, and part of what I do, there's a little old professor in me every once in a while comes out, and so this is my form for teaching, and so I see writing as a process, and for me, it is a teaching process, not telling like I used to, but having the characters bring you along so you have a feeling and an understanding of what they're dealing with. So it's not the typical Godfather approach to the mafia, which is a top-down, as I would describe it, approach where they're told and how they're working from the top. And I like to say that my books are a bottom-up approach at looking at the mafia and how it affects the individual people. And so I think that that's significantly different than maybe my little niche in all of this.
It's a very interesting approach, really. And like I said, this is a book that I normally wouldn't read, but the way you're describing it, it makes me want to read it. And frankly, as soon as I get off here, I'm going to have to at least get Sex Club. So I have to start at the beginning because I'm not going to start with Blind Pig, but obviously I am going to have to start with the Sex Club just to get the feel for the actual book. Now,
I think that's wise. I've written them so if somebody did pick up Blind Pig, it would be freestanding. But starting with Sex Club and working your way through it, the characters continue to evolve and develop. And Nicole Weatherspoon, who becomes a dominant player, who is a black lady who lost her husband to the mob, it becomes a dominant player in Blind Pig. But to understand that fully, you have to appreciate what she went through when the mob killed her husband, and left her with two boys to raise, so it's, I think you're wise to start with Sex Club.
Now, besides this, you also have another series. It's Love, Lies, and Liaisons. Can we touch base on just a little bit on that?
Yeah, that is a totally different venue. It started several years ago. In about 2010, I was with friends, and this lady kept saying, Les, you ought to write a book. I said, I don't have a storyline. She said, Les, you ought to write a book. Well, about 2 weeks later, I get an email from her, and she said, I haven't seen the first chapter yet. Well, wouldn't you know, she bugged me like that for about a month, and I sat down and said, and she said, you tell all of these stories about university presidents, because tongue-in-cheek, I was a university president at the time, and I thought many of them were a bunch of nerds, and so I was always poking fun at them. which I could do, because I was a president myself. Well, anyway, so I started thinking about this, and I did come in contact in my career with a person that had, as my mother would say, a zipper problem, and that's a nice way of saying it. In fact, he was my character.
We all come across those, I think.
Yeah, my character was having affairs with 5 women, professional women. Some different places. One maybe in the state capitol when he went there. Maybe another one when he went in conferences or whatever, which is not unusual. But anyway, I started writing about this person and completed that book and then took it to an editor. And she said, well, you write pretty well, but sociology papers don't sell. And the point of that was I had written it like a paper because I was a professor. And so she's the one that helped me. It took me 3 years then to write the first book, and that's Signature Affair. And it is about a university president who starts out his career, has some of the things that I did in my career, not the bedroom scenes. But anyway, it does have not exotic or explicit sex in it, but it does have a lot more sex because it's later in the book you'll find that he is he's addicted to sex and has that problem, and so then it goes through the addiction problems that he struggles with. He then goes in costly affair because they find out, of course, and he has to leave that little community, and he goes to North Carolina, which a fictitious university called Mountain State near Asheville, where I happen to live, and so the second book is about his trials and tribulations and the dual life, essentially, that a person lives as an addict and a professional career, which is very common, both men and women, by the way. Some people think that sex addiction is a male problem. It's more dominant among males, but there are a large number of females who have a sex addiction problem. But anyway, so he then, by that time, he has turned around 2 universities and has a national reputation in the field of education for educational reform. So it happens to be then that the President of the United States, in Presidential Affair, the third book in the trilogy, brings him to Washington, D.C. to help reform our public schools. So it does have some real, it's fictional, of course, but it does have real things that I think should happen in our public schools. For example, if you can't read at the first grade, you don't go on to the second grade. Pretty simple concept, but not practiced anywhere.
I believe back in the 80s, it was a practice that you had to reach benchmark before you went to the other grades, where now you get rewarded for doing nothing.
That's right, or whoever your parents are, or what you do, or whatever. Anyway, it just happens to be the first female president of the United States. So now my guy is working on the Hill during the day and working on real legislation and coming into contact with Senator Kennedy and other real people that were going on at that time. And by night, he is in the White House. So an interesting thing that I have about that is that one of my friends was a Secret Service agent for the Carters, and so he reviewed all of the material to make sure that when I was talking about the White House that I used the proper protocols, and I think that's kind of an interesting aspect. So there's a lot of realism in that book, although it is about the dual life and the struggles of a sex addict.
Again, you did a lot of research in blending all your fiction with the nonfiction and blending other protocols just to make the book feel real is astounding.
Yes, well, thank you. And I didn't mention, I want to go back to the first series. During my research for the Mafia book, I came in contact with the head of the FBI Division Detroit, who was there at the same time. I interviewed him 4 different times. I have about 24 hours or 23 hours of tapes of, or not tapes, but interviews of him. And again, there's insights that he shared because he's retired and is passed now, of real things that weren't even in the paper. For example, the coffee house that didn't serve coffee. He tells me a story about that, and insights that were going on, and raids that they made, and busts they made, and a T3, which was his top informant, and where he met with the top informant. And so I took a lot of that and incorporated it, into Sack Slub and into Blind Pig. So I think that there's some real significant things that people learn, from my books, because again, as I said, I have a little teaching left in me, and I'm still, the old professor, so to speak, in that regard.
That is a hidden gem that a lot of authors would fawn over, the opportunity to have a live person that was there during the time period, during the actual events that you're writing about for a fictional novel. That is, wow.
Yeah, it is a wow, because it is, but I'm trying to write historical crime fiction, and so, as I said before, it's amazing where my research has taken me to. I mentioned earlier the commission where the mobsters get together, a T3 informant, and what that means, and so it really was a joy to find out all of these things, and then find ways to weave my characters through the very cases that he was talking about, and my characters actually perform, so to speak, some real cases that he described for me.
My mind's blown at this point, because you put so much heart, soul, and research into this book. I am definitely buying Sex Club. Now, my question is there more books after this third book comes out?
Yes, there is. Right in front of me right now is For Hire. It is the next book in the series, and it will be covering the years 84, 86. I have a couple chapters done. Right across in my room, I have the storyboard laid out, and the way I do that is have each of the chapters divided up into chapters 1 through 5 and 6 through 10 and so on. I know it's going to be about 30 chapters, and so I color code the characters with little postums that are stuck on there, and so I have those already done, and I have the events picked out. Those are the newspaper clippings.
So you do basically a James Patterson in your framework.
Yeah,
he does
exactly.
almost the same thing. And
yes.
It's amazing to find authors that do this, because not too many have the patience to have the framework where it's color-coded to sticky notes to what's going to happen in every chapter. It's amazing to find an author that goes through extensive research.
Well, and I think what is so interesting to me, some people even detail it more, have pages of it, but what's interesting to me is to have a pink little slip in one case and know the character's going to be doing something, another event, 3 chapters from now. I absolutely, when I'm writing, have no idea how this character is going to get there. But your mind starts working, and this whole milieu of all this coming together with these events, and my mind takes me to that event. And I just think that's the fun part for me, is the creative part, dotting the I's, checking the T's, and crossing the T's and doing that. That's the creative part. And so that's what I can hardly wait to do. And so what typically happens is I'm finishing one book, my head is in the next book. Of course, you have hours and hours of editing, which is painstaking and not very exciting, has to be done, but my mind is into the next book.
And that is always where the fun begins, is starting that next book. But
right.
We only have a few minutes left, so before I let you go, where can the readers find you if they have questions about your book, if they want to connect with you, or shoot you an email?
Okay, we'll start with the email. It is author@lescochran.com. That's pretty simple, I think. author@lescochran.com. I have a website. It's lescochran.com. Not too difficult. I have a blog, lescochranblog.com. I have you can go on Facebook at Les Cochran, and we've tried to make it easy for people to get a hold of us. I blog a couple times a week, sometimes about current events, but usually about the characters and how an event or an experience, where I came up with this person's name or an event like that. Obviously, I'm on Amazon, but people can go through that route. And one of the other things that we're doing is we're doing a lot of book signings. I probably won't be, I am going to be doing one, a book signing in Athens, Georgia this fall, because guess what? There is a restaurant called The Blind Pig there. And so
now that is serendipitous.
So it's kind of you got to have a little fun in all this too. But it's very easy to get a hold of Les Cochran. Just Google it, and my name will start popping up. Go to my website or whatever the case might be.
Great. I'm glad it's nice and easy for our listeners to get a hold of you. And that's about as much time as we have today. So Les, thank you so much for coming on my show. It's been very enlightening, and I already have your book bookmarked for Amazon. And
okay. Well, thank you very much.
This is M.L.Ruscsak, or ML, signing off for Atlanta, and happy reading.